We're picking up here in Acts chapter 16. I'm going to back up into the last part of chapter 15 for our message this morning. And I'm going to start here at verse 36. Acts chapter 15, verse 36. And some days after, Paul said unto Barnabas, Let us go again and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord, and see how they do. So to place us in the story, Paul and Barnabas had just returned from Jerusalem. They had settled the issue of circumcision of the Gentile believers. The council at Jerusalem had determined that this was not necessary, that people could become believers without taking on all the Jewish rituals and sacrifices. And after some days, Paul has a desire to go visit the churches that they had established earlier. Now, it doesn't say exactly how long this is. I've heard some commentators say that it was as many as 5 years. Some think as small as 2 years. So between 2 and 5 years later, Paul and Barnabas are discussing the idea of going back to visit the churches that were established on the first missionary journey. Verse 37, and Barnabas determined to take with him John, whose surname was Mark. Verse 37. But Paul thought not good to take him with them, who had departed from them in Pamphylia, and went not with them to the work. So a division, a fight arose between Paul and Barnabas as to whether they should take John Mark with them. John Mark was Barnabas' nephew. Barnabas, the son of encouragement, wanted to give John Mark a second chance, bring him on the missionary journey. But Paul said no, and they were diametrically opposed to each other. In verse 39, the contention was so sharp between them that they departed asunder from one another. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed unto Cyprus. So if you remember from Acts chapter 4, Barnabas was from the island of Cyprus. Barnabas was a Levite from the island of Cyprus. And they had made the island of Cyprus was their first stop on the first missionary journey. So they knew the churches there. Barnabas undoubtedly had friends there in Cyprus. So the work splits. God in his provision sends Barnabas and John Mark to Cyprus. And now Paul, we're going to see in a minute, chooses Silas and departs for the north. So this is going to be the last time we see Barnabas in the book of Acts. Barnabas was martyred on the island of Cyprus by Elymas, the false prophet who confronted Paul and Barnabas during their first journey to the island some years earlier. So now here we continue here in Acts chapter 15. So Paul chose Silas, verse 1540, and departed, being recommended by the brethren unto the grace of God. So Silas, there in verse 40, is also, you'll sometimes see his name spelled Silvanus. Silas was an elder in the church at Jerusalem, and he was a prominent person in that church who the Jerusalem council had sent along with Paul to verify the letter that Paul had concerning the circumcision of the Gentiles. So Paul and Silas was also a prophet, departed being recommended by the brethren. So the church there in Antioch recommended them. They sent them out unto the grace of God. And so Paul, verse 41, and he went through Syria and Cilicia, confirming the churches. So from Antioch, I don't have my map this morning, but from Antioch, Paul and Silas would have traveled north over the trade route into what is modern-day Turkey. At the time, they considered that, in Roman era, they considered that Asia. Turkey they called Asia Minor. And so Paul and Silas traveled into Asia Minor, eventually arriving at the city of Derbe, which was the last city visited on the first missionary journey. Acts 16, verse 1. And then came he to Derbe and Lystra. So if you remember, the city of Lystra was a city where Paul and Barnabas, they arrived in the city, they were preaching. There was a lame man there in the city. The man was healed. He jumped up and started praising God. And all the people talking in the Lystronian language thought that Paul was Hermes and Barnabas was Zeus, come to visit them a second time based on an old myth that Hermes and Zeus had visited them years earlier and not found a warm welcome and destroyed the city by flood. So now here, when Paul and Barnabas show up with this miracle, they think that they are gods and they're ready to sacrifice to them. It was only when Paul and Barnabas realized what was going on that they ran in amongst the crowd and said, "Don't sacrifice to us, don't sacrifice to us." And then in the fickle way of these pagans, men from another city came to Lystra and convinced them that not only were Paul and Barnabas not gods, but that they should be stoned. And so they stoned Paul, dragged him outside of the city of Lystra, and left him for dead. So here you have Paul going back to that same city where he was stoned and left for dead outside of the city. And behold, a certain disciple was there named Timotheus. So this is Timothy, who we're familiar with as Timothy, the son of a certain woman which was a Jewish and believed, but his father was a Greek. So Timothy came from a Jewish mother and a Greek father. Now, in Jewish tradition, in Jewish custom, the offspring, the Jewish offspring, the baby, takes the religion of the mother. So if the mother's Jewish, the baby is Jewish. That's purely for practical reasons. It's a very pragmatic way of going about the situation. So Timothy's mother was a Jew, so therefore he was a Jew. Now his father was a Greek, so that was a bit unusual. You didn't see Jews marrying Greeks in the land of Israel. But out in the other parts of the world where the Jews had dispersed out, this was a much more common thing for Jews to marry outsiders, Gentiles. It was a much more common practice. And so it wasn't that out of the ordinary to have out in these outer regions a Jewish woman marrying a Greek husband. But the upshot of this is that Timothy was not circumcised. The Greeks deified the human body. They worshipped it essentially. When they had these Greek games, the athletes were naked. They competed naked. They had these baths and things, and you could, if someone was circumcised, you could tell. You knew it. And the Greeks considered circumcision to be it wasn't a Greek custom at all. They disliked it. They considered that in their eyes that circumcising someone was damaging the body which they held in high reverence. So they would not circumcise. The Greeks did not circumcise their children, their kids. But Paul, meeting Timothy, his father was verse 2, Paul, or Timothy, was well reported by the brethren which were at Lystra and Iconium. So Timothy had apparently been a believer for 3 to 5 years, and during that time, this young man had distinguished himself among the body of believers as a faithful person, as a kid who was serious about the Lord Jesus Christ. He was serious about his faith. He was serious about loving God. And he had a good family. In 2 Timothy, we see Paul making reference to his grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice, who encouraged him in his faith. So if you have grandkids and kids, grandmothers, encourage your grandkids. That makes a difference in these kids' lives. Love these kids. Timothy had that kind of love poured into his life from his faithful grandmother Lois, his faithful mother Eunice, and it molded him. It made him into a man of character, and Paul saw this in this man. Verse 3, him would Paul have to go forth with him, and took and circumcised him because of the Jews which were in those quarters, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. Now you have to catch the irony of the situation here. Paul and Silas are carrying a letter saying that the Gentiles don't have to be circumcised, and here Paul finds this Jewish boy and takes him and circumcises him, so that when they appear in the Jewish synagogues in their future ministry, that they would accept Timothy. See, they would know that Timothy was a Jew, but if he wasn't circumcised, then they wouldn't accept him in these Jewish synagogues. And so for the sake of ministry, for the sake of reaching the Jews, and Timothy was a Jew, Paul took and circumcised Timothy so that they would be able to enter into these synagogues, and without any contradiction whatsoever with the letter that Paul was carrying, saying that Gentiles did not have to be circumcised to be Christians. So Paul was able to negotiate these very thorny issues. He was able to navigate around these very delicate issues with great grace and aplomb, and he managed to get past these things. And as they went through the cities, they delivered them the decrees for to keep that were ordained of the apostles and elders which were at Jerusalem. So as they went through these cities, they would read this letter that Paul and Silas had. Verse 5, and so were the churches established in the faith and increased in the number, look at this, daily. Daily, the churches increased in number. The churches were established in the faith. And so that Paul and Barnabas start their journey. They start their journey to encourage the churches on a good step.